Good afternoon, Brollies. My name is Marina Pretorius. I'm an organizational psychologist and currently consulting with PPG and working closely with the group Human Capital team. I was part of the design of the core and the inner core series, and it is my privilege to stand in for Andile and Aline today in opening this session and welcoming our guest speaker. Here we are, session 12 of the core series. We have had a lot of touching feedback about these sessions and how they had a substantial impact on many Brollies. We set out to bring you these sessions as a recognition of the difficult times we all found ourselves in over the last year and a half. Many of the industry professionals we had the privilege of hosting in the series applauded Brol's dedication to their staff and their well-being. We have touched on many pressing issues during the course of this series that in some way asked all of us to maybe change certain things in order to strengthen our core. We now would like to close the loop with highlighting the process of change, whatever that change may be for you. Today's speaker is Dr. Patakuhle Zondi. Dr. Zondi is a sports and exercise medicine physician experienced in clinical sports medicine, executive management, and leadership. She served as Chief Executive Officer of the Sports Science Institute of South Africa between 2016 and 2020, and currently holds numerous directorships in national sports bodies in South Africa. In 2020, she established a consultancy in clinical sports medicine and strategy development in sport, and has led the development of medical strategy for high-performance teams and optimizing the well-being and performance of athletes from a number of sporting codes. In 2021, she served as Chief Medical Officer for Team South Africa for the Tokyo Olympic Games. Dr. Zondi has a love for teaching and is involved in corporate training and postgraduate academic training. She's also a mom of 2 daughters who teaches her in turn about life and growth. We would love all of you to engage in this session to get the most out of it. Please share any questions or insights that you have in the chat box with myself and Dr. Zondi, and we will cover that then in the last part of the session. Welcome, Dr. Zondi, and thank you for being with us today. We look forward to hearing your insights on embracing the gift in the gap.
Thank you very much, Marina, and to Sade and Andile and the executive team for inviting me into your conversation. I'd also like to say thank you very much. Let me just turn this on and share the screen. I'm trusting all that's in order. So good afternoon, Brollies. It's a real privilege to be with you this afternoon. Some of you we met, in inverted commas, last year at about a similar time when you had another series that was also aimed at essentially helping you navigate the journey that we find ourselves on. So it's a real privilege to be invited back to share some thoughts with you as you wrap up this 12-part series. Yeah, because what a journey it's been. Most of us are tired. We are ready to be on the other side of these turbulent waters. But it's been such a protracted period of turbulence that the grit, the resilience, the mindfulness, they've started to wear thin at some point. And I guess generally, when in life you've been in a prolonged state of flux, you've been in a prolonged state of uncertainty, of difficulty, when you've been challenged for a lengthened period of time, or when you're struggling to reach the target that you've set for yourself, it gets to a point where you feel like you aren't making progress or like you're going nowhere slowly. So take a moment to think of the last time you felt like this. A time when you recently felt like you're not making progress, where you can see where you want to go or where you want to be, but you feel like you're just not getting there fast enough. Now stop and look back. Look back to where you've been. And I'm going to ask this question and answer it out loud, and if you're by yourself, tell me if you can say that you are not where you once were. So there's a gap between where you are and where you once were. But there's also a gap between where you are and where you want to be. And this is what I'd like to focus our conversation on today, on living in this gap and realizing the gift of living in this gap. So I want to put an upfront disclaimer, really, or rather acknowledgement that I got the inspiration of this theme, this exact theme, the gift is in the gap, from a WhatsApp that I was sent last week, actually, as I was still trying to map out how we were going to have this conversation. And it's essentially a sermon that was taken from Elevation Church. And I'll quote much of what he said. It won't be a sermon, I promise you, but just before I'm accused of plagiarism for using some of the words that were also used there. Now, with that disclaimer out the way, let me tell you a little bit about myself and create some context for some of the stories that I would like to share with you today. So I am born and raised in Durban, South Africa's playground. I have 2 older brothers, 1 older sister, and 36 other brothers and sisters who in English would be referred to as cousins. We were all raised together with not one weekend passing without us seeing one cousin or the other. More often than not, we had 1 or 2 of our cousins staying with us, or we would stay with them. We moved together as a clan, especially during the holidays, one big play group, and a real treat and a treasure for those of you who grew up similarly. My parents, all 20 of them, raised us to be honest, to work hard, and to love each other fiercely. I grew up in a big family, and my earliest childhood memories are of going on holiday, either with my nuclear family or with the extended family. And our holidays were always very active or cultural, right? We were always outdoors, which is why I've got those pictures there. But we only went on holiday like once or twice a year. And outside of holidays, we spent our weekends participating in fun runs or supporting each other in sports events and more sports events as we grew older. And my earliest memory of this particularly is when I was about 4 or 5 years old, and we are seconding my dad on the Comrades route. And that's a picture of my dad there, who had quite a big influence on my upbringing. So I grew up with a family that was big and a family that really loved to be active and do things outside. And in turn, I learned to love that kind of life too. So much so that I decided to make a career of it. So I studied sports medicine, or medicine first, and then studied sports medicine. There we go. And then studied sports medicine. I have had the great privilege of working with a wide variety of athletes, both recreational and elite athletes. And with the elite athletes, I've journeyed through three Olympic cycles and attended 3 Olympic Games. You know, the Olympic and Paralympic Games obviously being the pinnacle of performance or sporting performance by most standards. Those moments are spectacular. You know, they really are. They're a kind of paradise with the creme de la creme of athletes, support staff, infrastructure organization. It's a production of the highest and most glamorous standards. But what you see as paradise from the outside, those of us who sit on the inside, we know that this paradise is a process. It's a multitude of organizational and operational processes that essentially enable the spectacular performance that you get to witness. It's years of training, it's years of physical preparation, it's years of coaching processes that enable the athletes to perform as they do during the Olympic and Paralympic Games. So what you see on this slide is a combination of photos from the 3 games. So from 2012 London, 2016 Rio Paralympics, and then most recently 2020 Tokyo. And it's taken, as you can see, with medal-winning athletes, but it's also taken, quite frankly, with those athletes who at some point along the journey won my heart. Because the harsh reality of sport, of course, and the Olympics, is that 34 people, as an example, will qualify for an event, but only three will walk away with the medal. So if your only definition of success as an athlete or a coach is winning a medal, you may never experience paradise. I've been to Olympic Games, I've been to World Cups, I've been to World Championships, but this right here is one of my most cherished memorabilia. This is a signed t-shirt from the 2010 Youth Olympics, which were hosted in Singapore. I went there as team doctor to a group of South African 17-year-olds who were competing at these games. So the first signature that I'm gonna blast is from Quanita Bobbs. She's a hockey player, she's a utility player. And 2 years after the 2010 Youth Olympics, she made a debut for the senior national team at the Olympic Games and has proceeded to feature quite strongly in the national team, the hockey team. In 2020, she was one of the key players and started every match. This second signature doesn't really need introduction, but for those of you who can't read it, it's a little message from Chad le Clos. He signed this as his star was only just beginning to rise, before he knew that he would be a 3-time Olympian, when his immediate goal as a 17-year-old was, I just want to get my license doc so that I can drive myself where I need to go. And where I need to go, mind you, was, yes, going to training, but also going to do what 17-year-olds do. I've had the privilege of journeying with these athletes in the gap between the Olympic Games, right? In some way or form, not necessarily Quinita Bobs, but I've had the journey of journeying with these athletes, Chad and other athletes, in the gap between the games. I have seen them at their lowest. I've seen them work towards their peak. I've seen them break. I've seen them pivot, build, stumble, survive, and then thrive. See, Olympians aren't born Olympians. They start as kids who want to play sport. And then someone along the line realizes that they've got a talent, of course. This talent is nurtured. They enter competitions. The competitions become more serious and professional. They go from wanting to win a school gala to aspiring to just be in the provincial team and then win provincial champs and then go to nationals and then a World Cup. And maybe at that point, they start thinking about the Olympics. Like you and I, as they grow into their own, as they grow, so does the gap between where they are and where they want to be grow. Just like you and I, if they don't stop to look back at the progress that they've made, the progress that they've made from winning that first school gala, the progress that they've made to wearing national colors, the progress that then they've made to actually featuring in the Olympic Games and calling themselves an Olympian, if they don't stop to look back, they may miss the magic of the moment. So in demonstrating the gift of the gap, I would like to share 3 stories with you today. 3 stories that bring this to life in human form and in recent experiences, which I think in some way you'll be able to relate to or at least draw inspiration from. So the first gift of the gap is growth. Does anyone recognize this young chap? And I'll actually give like points. If anyone actually does recognize this person and you can say his name, Sade, I'm going to say we need to give them something. I'm going to take it that there is no recognition. So I'm going to tell you about this young man. In fact, let me take it back to this picture. So this young man was born and raised in Mpumalanga. He was born with a condition called hemimelia, which basically means that the bones in the lower part of your leg, below your knee, don't grow and don't develop in utero. So he's never been able to walk, and he spent most of his life in a wheelchair, or his young life in a wheelchair. He went to a school for children with disabilities, and in 2011, after he was assessed by an OT, an occupational therapist, he was assessed as having a learning disorder and was about to be moved on to another school or transferred to another school for kids who would need special support. But somewhere during the line before this happened, he was an organization, an NPO, came to visit his school. The NPO, the name of the NPO is Jumping Kids. And this is an NPO essentially that provides access to lower limb prosthetics to children from previously disadvantaged communities. So they come to a school and they show them these prosthetics. And this young man goes home and says to his parents, remember, he lives in Mpumalanga, township kind of lifestyle. Mom, I want to chop off my legs. Now, if anyone has grown up in a family or knows, let me say Black families and communities, and, you're 10 or 11, you're telling your parents you want to chop off your legs, it's a foreign concept. Anyway, obviously his parents say no. He goes back and he persists. He's like, I just want to chop off my legs. And why does he want to do this? Because all this young boy has ever wanted to do is play soccer with his friends in the township. That's all he's ever wanted to do, right? And he hasn't been able to do it. So he's now seen from the visits of this NPO that there's a way for him to actually get artificial legs and he'll be able to play soccer with his friends. That's his dream. Keeps on going back to his parents, and eventually his parents go into the school to ask, what is this thing? Where they then speak to a physiotherapist, they speak to the NPO guys, and then they understand what the opportunity might be with him amputating that below the knee, where his legs basically have not developed fully, and then getting prosthetics. And so eventually they concede. So this young man learns to walk. At some point, this is him. He learns to walk, he learns to play soccer, and he absolutely loves it, right? Here's him playing soccer. He then starts to realize that, hang on, he can run, and he's actually pretty good at it. And the thing about this NPO is that they do encourage inclusion and activity and participation in sport, and they support this. So he learns to run. By now, you should start to recognize this guy. And he likes it so much so that in 2016, which is 4 years after he got a bilateral knee amputation, he lines up at the starting blocks of the Paralympic Games in the T42 100-meter final, and he races to a single silver medal. This is in 2016. In case you don't recognize him, this is Ntando Mahlangu. So here's the thing about Ntando, right? It started out with him just wanting to play soccer with his friends because that's what he saw in the township, and that's what he yearned for as a little boy who couldn't participate and who just loved the idea of soccer. But as he started to play soccer, he realized actually he can run, and there's more to this. So as he moved forward, so did the goal, because that's the thing about the gap, right? It grows as you grow. So he's shifting the goal, and he keeps himself in this gap of process, this gap of progress, which is thrilling if you recognize the growth that it represents. This was 2016. He won a silver medal in the 100-meter. This, you should recognize this now if you didn't recognize him, is Ntando Mahlangu in the 2020 Tokyo Paralympic Games, where he won a gold medal for long jump, and where he also won a gold medal in his 200-meter final. Growth is thrilling or rather the gap is thrilling, if you recognize that it represents growth. But it can also be demoralizing if you lose sight of that growth and if you don't stop to look back at how far you've come. This is the same boy who started out only wanting to play soccer with his friends, which he did. And in 2020 is a 3-time Olympic medalist. The second gift of the gap is gratitude. So this young lady needs no introduction. Most of you, whether you have followed the Olympics or not, will now recognize this face, the face of our golden girl, Tatiana Schoonmaker. I met Tatiana in 2012, or around about 2012, when I was working at the High Performance Center in Pretoria. And at that time, she was a high school student at the Tuck Sport High School, a very talented athlete that basically excelled at provincial level. But obviously for her to enroll at Tuck Sport means that she and her parents had dreams for her, and they felt that she could go the extra mile in swimming, whatever that meant to them at that particular time. I say this because Tuck Sport High School, if you don't know it, is a school that specifically accommodates high performance athletes and essentially supports them or allows them to pursue their sporting career while staying at school. So they support their academics wherever the athlete is, traveling internationally or locally. So although many of you may have come to know her now after her win, the reality is that Tatiana's Olympic gold has been at least 10 years in the making. And I'm only counting from the time that she was at Tuck Sport High School, right? So it's been at least 10 years in the making, 10 years in which she has won some races and lost many more, right? But let's fast forward to July 28 of this year, when Tatiana competes in the 200-meter breaststroke heat. So she's already got a silver medal in the 100 meters, and she's now in the 200-meter breaststroke heat. There are 2 rounds to go in the final, and she wins this heat in an Olympic record time of 2 minutes and 19 seconds. She jumps to the top seed for the event, and she's now a favorite to win in the final. Remember, she's in heat, so she's still got a semi to go and then a final. So she's interviewed afterwards, and they ask her about the race, and her just excitement is, I don't think I have the words to describe how happy I am right now. And she can say this is still in the heat. She can say this because she's looking back at just how far she's come to be able to compete in the heat and smash an Olympic record in the heat already. So she's concentrating on the now and really happy about how far she's come. And what it took to get there, of course, she knows the sacrifice she's made. She knows the commitments she's had to make. So then the the reporter goes on to ask her about the win, right? About the win coming on. Now, remember, she's just won the heat. They're still the same way. They're still the final. So there's a few obstacles to go. And in the question, he basically alludes to the fact that it's pretty much a given that she's going to win this event, essentially. And her response to the question that he frames like this is, at this point, I just want to get into the final. If I can just make it into the final, because if I've got a lane, I've got a chance. And I think for me, like Tatiana had taken it right there for me in my heart, at least, because those words are just so profound to me. Give yourself a chance, right? And the gap is your chance. The gap is your lane. And you've got to be in the game to win the game. So it's about staying in the game, about staying in the gap, staying in faith and staying in courage. The gap isn't there to demoralize you, right? You need both gaps. A gap that will make you grateful. So Tatiana, in that moment of winning that heat of the Olympic medal, she could say, she doesn't have the words to describe how happy she is. She could recognize that even though before she'd won an Olympic medal and she didn't know that there was no guarantees that she was going to win it, but she could recognize that this was a moment to cherish and celebrate, because there was a gap between where she was right now in smashing an Olympic medal, or rather an Olympic time record in a heat. There was a gap between where she started and where she is. And in that gap lies gratitude. And so you need both gaps. The gap that makes you grateful and a gap that makes you grow. So let's bring it back home, right? Let's step away from the Olympians for a little bit and consider us mere mortals and ask ourselves, I guess, how do we start to experience the gift of the gap or the gift in the gap? Sometimes you have to look back, and often you have to look back and see how far you've come. I mean, that's the first step, right? The next critical step, or the next critical aspect, really, now that you know that the gap is not a threat, right? And I've given you two examples who clearly show that the gap isn't a threat, that there's growth in the gap, that there's opportunity in that gap. So now that you know that the gap is not a threat, and that perhaps you are exactly where you need to be, the next step is equipping you with the tools, the resources, and the space to navigate this gap. And that's very much a key goal of this core series, is to give you an ambit of tools or to have conversations that will help top up the emotional, physical, mental fuel, and that will keep you on course and help you navigate this gap. We all want to get to paradise. Paradise being the other side of this turbulence, paradise being the other side of COVID and all its disruptions, the other side of grief, of mourning, of restructure, of financial fallouts, depression, tensions in relationships, the other side of tired, because many of us are tired. We want to be living on the other side in this paradise. But the reality, all of our reality, is that we live in process. And the prize, if we have the correct perspective, is in the process. The pleasure is in the process. And that's the last story that I am going to share today. A story about the pleasure of being in the process. So this is me in March 2019. So I had been invited, this is at the time that I was still at the Sports Science Institute, and I was invited to this corporate experience called Epic Trippers. And essentially what that is you get invited to a glamping experience where you get to cycle little bits of the Epic. So it's certainly not the distance of the Epic, but you maybe cycle 40, 50 kilometers and you intersect with some of the routes of the Epic. And you're basically spoiled by APSA. So I'm invited to this. I don't mountain bike, right? I've last been on a bike in 2013 before I fell pregnant with my first child. And that's the last time I was on a bike outdoors, at least, not a spinning bike. But because I'm one of those people who's like, yes, challenge outdoors, let's go. I'm like, okay, I borrow a bike, get it the week before this, ride it once, and then go to Trippers. You can see what my experience was like, all right? I hacked my way through it. I fell more times than I can count. And this particular picture was taken after a particularly bad fall where I literally thought I might have actually broken something or burst something like intra-abdominal organ or something like that. Anyway, I did get up, as you can tell, and was able to laugh about it through the pain. And the person in the blue there is Dave Ballez. He is the race director for the, it's not called the Cape Town Cycle Tour. It's a new name now. And after this happened, he was like, you know what, Pato, let's maybe take a detour and go on the road back to our base. I think he was really worried that I was going to kill myself if I carried on doing this, and there'd be liabilities involved. But anyway, so we take the scenic route, and in our conversation, we are talking. He starts to share with me, as I said, he's the race director for the Cape Town Cycle Tour. He starts to share with me about, his challenges and ask me questions about, the lack of diversity in cycling. He's sharing with me how the field of women who participate in cycling events, both road and mountain bike, but particularly mountain bike, is actually decreasing over the years. And I found this to be quite peculiar, right? Because we live in a time when women are increasingly health conscious and they are being proactive about taking measures that will protect and improve their health. I mean, I see this firsthand in my clinical practice, and certainly, I mean, the fitness industry is reporting this. Now, I also have a clinical interest in the exercising female, and specifically from an academic point of view, the female athlete's health and performance. And then in terms of advocacy and academics, I publish a fair amount, and I'm involved in leadership groups whose agenda it is to advance gender equity, as well as diversity and inclusion within sport and sport and exercise medicine. So this is very much my home ground and very much my language and what I essentially live for clinically and in terms of advocacy. So the conversation we have as we're riding back to our base really struck a chord with me. And months after I'd participated in Epic Trippers, I would just keep thinking about it, and like it bothered me, right? It's like we're living in a time where more people and more women specifically are active, So why is it that in cycling, the trend is the opposite? So it bothered me, and it sort of like lingered so much in my mind that I actually decided, you know what, I'm going to find out. I need to figure out why this is a problem within cycling. And the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to try it, right? I'm going to involve myself in the sport and see for myself what the barriers to participation are. And boy, did I experience these barriers to participation, from the cost of participating in the sport, because bikes are ridiculously expensive or can be ridiculously expensive, to the constraints that you experience if you're female versus male, constraints in terms of safety. You're not going to go out riding in particular places alone, or even with two of you, which many men can do, either ride alone or even ride at least in pairs where there's safety in numbers. But also just the simple thing of the time that you have available to you as a female, right? And so if you're training for marathons or stage races, you need to spend, you need to do at least one long ride a weekend, so that's a Saturday or a Sunday that you're spending 4 to 6 hours on a bike. So now who's taking care of the kids? So I experienced these barriers, right? But beyond the barriers, beyond the obstacles, I've also never experienced such beauty, such thrill, and so much fun exploring our country. Somewhere during the process of, I called it like investigative experiences, somewhere during the process of trying to get an answer to this question and this conundrum that Dave Ballez had shared with me of decreasing participation in cycling, and specifically a lack of diversity, somewhere during the process of getting the answer, I got hooked on the process of learning a new skill, the process of getting better at bike handling, the process of getting stronger, of meeting new people, of going places. And yay, I'm a cyclist now. Less than a year or 2 years later, I can honestly say I'm a fully fledged cyclist. I cycle more than I run these days. I've stayed in the gap. I've the gap that keeps me growing as I become more skilled or as I become more strong on the bike. But as I grow, of course, and as I become better, because touch wood, cross fingers, I haven't experienced a fall like that again. But of course, I went and I got coaching. I joined a group. I kind of did things properly the way I probably should have done to start with. But as I grow, so too does the gap in front of me as a cyclist in terms of the experiences that I want to have on my bike. These are just a snapshot of what's happened since that fall. I have traveled to Bali, where I did a whole 60K, 70K that trip through the volcanoes. It was the most spectacular experience. I joined a cycling club of female cyclists and made incredible friends. I've forged a relationship with APSA, whose aim is essentially to increase the participation of females within the sport of cycling. And of course, I've taken my kids along for the ride as well. And so there's very many a time that me and my 6-year-old will go to the bike park or go cycling together. It's honestly become a lifestyle. But I'm staying in this gap because it's taken me to places that I otherwise never would have gone to. So let me take this back to the beginning of our conversation, and let's link it back to what's happening in our world today, and specifically in your world today. Consider your current circumstances. Just think about where you are, I guess, in life right now. How many of you can say that you are where you want to be? Are you where you want to be? Now look back at where you've come from. Look back on the journey that you've been. And then I'm going to ask you, how many of you can say that you are not where you used to be? See, the expectation is that as you move towards where you want to be, the gap behind you will get bigger and the gap in front of you will decrease. But the gap in front, it never goes away, because as you grow, the gap stays. And that's okay, right? That's okay if you're comfortable with the knowledge of being in that gap. You need both gaps, right? The gap, as we said, that makes you grateful, and the gap that makes you grow. So in his sermon, he says, the same grace that created the gap between where you are and where you were is the grace that you need to keep moving forward. So stay in the middle, stay in faith, stay in courage. Find the pleasure in the process and the gift in the gap. And that's where I'd like to leave it today, in realizing that while we absolutely yearn to see ourselves on the other side of this, we should take a moment to realize how far we've come. And we should appreciate the process of what we're doing and what we are becoming. Thank you.
Dr. Parthu, thank you so much for this wonderful perspective that you've shared with us on the gap. I think when we started this series, the uppermost perspective was, we are where we don't want to be, and therefore we need to put in all these tools. But you've given a fresh perspective on this process in between that we can also say has gone past in this past 18 months. So thank you very much for that new perspective on the time has gone by and the hope for moving forward. We have some great thank yous from people in the group. Thank you for the encouraging words and the motivation from Kuli. Thank you, it's very inspirational. Thank you so much for the encouraging presentation. Colleagues, please send on any questions you have or any maybe stories of how you have managed this gap and what growth and what gratefulness you can share on the chat about this gap that we've experienced between where we were and where we wanted to be. There's some questions from my side while we also see the comments coming in. You seem to be living quite a busy life, and our whole series was also about mindfulness, about building into ourselves those times to strengthen ourselves. How do you stay balanced in your busy schedule?
So it's quite interesting that I have this conversation about balance, and I've just had it recently. But to be very honest, I don't necessarily know that balance truly exists. I think it really is about integrating the different aspects of your life. and accepting that at some point you might be spending more time on one thing at the expense of another, and other times you might have to spend more time on the other thing, at the expense of another. And I guess it's about finding that integration and that point at which you're comfortable. I happen to really enjoy the work that I do, right? And so when I'm working, it's not like I'm miserable. And I accept that there'll be times that I travel, and that means I'm spending less time with my family. Part of it for me is I really go the extra mile to try and involve my family in what I do. And with sports, of course, it's easy, right? So we can have these experiences together. I can bring them on the journey so that they don't feel that they're excluded from that aspect of my life, And then there's other times that I just drop everything and I say no to work engagements because I just want to be with my family. But I think fundamentally for me, it's the recognition that I don't know if you can ask any woman, but any man even, that, if they found the perfect balance, because it probably doesn't exist. And you just have to accept that you're going to have to integrate everything. You're going to have to juggle. And at some points, one thing will take a preference and the other will have to just dampen down a little bit.
Okay.
I also see, I want to make a comment here, sorry. I see that Badenhorst, I can't see the first name, got it right, Blade Runner at Afi. So Sade, I'm going to ask a box of chocolate at least, because I think very few people, unless you've heard me speaking about this before, would actually be able to recognize Dando. So well done to Badenhorst.
Yes, Elske Badenhorst. Great. So we have a question also from Elske saying, how do super athletes overcome disappointments and pick themselves up again?
That's such a great question. He's saying, no, he was at school with my kids in primary school. All right. So, okay, you had inside info, then it's not fair. Look, it's a really great question. And so much can be learned from athletes. Very definitely, it's individual. So different people have different strategies. But I think the important thing is, firstly, they've got an innate sense of confidence, right? A confidence that has been built by practice and repetition. So many times they know that they're good at what they do. They might not know that they're the best, but they know that they're actually good at what they've got to do, what they do, because they've worked on it. They've got the natural talent, but they've also worked on it, right? And that gives you some kind of confidence, that I can get up and keep going. But they're also very clearly, those who do get up, they've got a goal, they've got a specific aim in mind. And so staying down is not going to help them achieve that goal, quite literally. And I think it's focusing on, it's the confidence that, this didn't work out this time. I didn't get this medal. I bombed out in this 100 meters, but I know I'm good at what I do because I've practiced it and because I've seen other examples of my being good at what I do. And also I know what I want to achieve, and I think many times it's a combination of that. They also, and you can relate that to your own life, right? You'll have the confidence to know that you're good at what you do if you practice it, so you need to equip yourself and skill yourself to do it. And there will be examples along your journey. Forget this one failure. Look at your other successes just to back you, just to remind you that you're actually good at what you're doing. And then focus on the goal. And the other really important thing that I would want to highlight is team, because no athlete works in isolation, not a single one. Even your 100-meter athletes or those who are involved in individual sport, especially at that particular level, they are surrounded by a team of people, from their coaches to their families to the professionals that are physiotherapists, dietitians, sports medicine physicians, psychologists. There's a team of people who surround them so that when they forget how good they are, there are people to remind them. When they are tired and they don't want to get up, after we've given them a little bit of a break, we help them get up. And I think, again, that's an important lesson that we should internalize, right? Is that no man is an island, and you need to surround yourself in a team with a team of people who will remind you of your star, of your shine when you forget, and who will help you and nudge you along the way.
Excellent. I think, thank you so much for that. I think it's speaking also into a next question that we have from Linda, who's asking, are there any tips on how to make the gaps smaller and shorter?
So I guess that you're going to have to look at that with perspective, right? And the question is, do you want to make the gap shorter? Because remember, the gap doesn't mean that you're not growing. And I think that's something I try to emphasize. The gap simply means that as you grow, the gap stays. Because as a really good example, with the two people that I gave an example of, Tatiana did participate in the last Olympics, and I think she made it to the final or semi-final, I can't even remember. And at a particular stage, her goal was just to make it to the Olympics, right? At some stage, and she made it. Then when she entered this Olympic Games, her goal was just to make it to the final. right? Literally, that was her goal. And she said time and time again, I just wanted to make it into the final. And again, she makes it there because she's like, if I'm in the final, if I've got a lane, I might have a chance. But her actual goal was to make it to the final. But as soon as she made it there, the goal shifted, right? So she made it to the first Olympics, then realized what she needs to do to take it further, to make it to a final. She went back and she worked for 4 years. And then the goal coming into 2020 was to make it into the final. But somewhere along the line, obviously, she realized, hang on, I can make it into the final, but I can also do more. And so again, like the gap doesn't necessarily get smaller and shorter. The gap just stays because the goal shifts, and not in a way that's meant to demoralize you, in a way that inspires growth, right? If you look at it like that. But I guess maybe another way you can frame this question is, how do you make the gap more tolerable, manageable, easy, pleasurable? Because if we accept that there's something to be enjoyed in the gap and that there'll actually always be a gap, you must recognize your progress. You must celebrate the wins. You must have gratitude with the journey. But the gap will always be there. So how do you make it more pleasurable? I think it's about perspective, remembering to look back and have gratitude, recognizing the milestones that you've ticked and celebrating them. Cherish the moments, even the small milestones. Again, surround yourself with people who will support you during turbulent times, because within the gap, there's also turbulence, as we're experiencing. And we were never meant to navigate this life alone, so surround yourself with people who will play back to you what you need to hear, or help you just get through that by distracting you, even if you need to be distracted at that particular time. People who will love you despite or in spite of everything.
Yeah, it's so true. And I think your message is also speaking to the core of this campaign and this series, is to say the gap will continue to exist, but there are things that you can do and that you can take ownership of, to see, to recognize, to acknowledge, to build, to strengthen yourself with, in order to make the experience of the gap less negative or less harmful. And that is all part of the gap will remain, but the experience of it can be enhanced and can be lived through. It's just a question out of interest in terms of the Tokyo Olympic Games. I guess that was a way different Olympics than what you have ever experienced before. What was the experience on the ground of the impact that COVID had on the Olympic Games?
Sure, a difficult one to actually even know where to start answering. Obviously, the Olympic Games firstly was postponed for a year, right, because of COVID. So there were always going to be multiple ways in which COVID intersects with how the game is delivered and how the game has experienced itself. So just from an athlete preparation perspective, obviously, athletes didn't prepare the same way that they could, or that they usually did, because they weren't the same kind of competitions. So just in terms of injury, I can't say it affected quality of performance, because as you see, there were Olympic records and world records that were broken. But certainly the experience leading up to it from an athlete perspective, both in terms of physical preparation, mental preparation, and just the stress of the environment was quite something. Then just in terms of the games themselves, I must be honest, the layers of complexity that COVID introduced in terms of just getting athletes on a flight to Japan and into Japan were really intricate, from the number of tests that needed to be done, just the processes that needed to be put in place between governments and with athletes understanding the implications. And the IOC was committed to a safe games, which means there were certain things that were non-negotiable in terms of testing, in terms of, isolation, in terms of just safety protocol, like the distancing and hygiene measures. There were things that were non-negotiable. And whether or not you believe that COVID is a thing that was happening, and because of course we've all got individual beliefs, you had to comply with that. And so the process of educating and upskilling athletes was quite something. The experience of the Olympic Games without spectators is also very different. And I know that they went out of their ways to create an experience for the athletes. And what I can say, it didn't compromise the quality of performance. But then again, for somebody like a Tatiana, and like I said, I won't claim to know her closely. And, I just happened to meet her and intersect with her in that period at the High Performance Center. And then again now, but I know how close she is with her family, and I just, you feel that when you're going to experience a moment like that, it would have just, I even get shivers thinking about it now, how it would have just been so much more wonderful for her to experience it with her family around. And they were denied that. But be that as it may, I think the games gave something to the world at a time that we needed it. I said when we were preparing for the games, because it was really so challenging and we didn't know up until a month before whether it was actually going to go ahead. You know, when I got onto that flight, we actually raised a toast to say, I can't believe we're actually on this flight and going, because it was always touch and go until it actually happened. And I remember thinking, you know, while I was up at 2:00 in the mornings, taking calls from Tokyo and Japan, I was like, I hope this is worth it. I hope it's worth it for the athletes. And I hope it's worth it, given that we're staging an elite event in the middle of a global pandemic. And I think being on this side of it now, I can confidently say that I think it was for the athletes, but also for the experience and for what the games did for the morale, I think, of the world.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Yeah, that was actually absolutely my experience as well. That beacon of hope and achievement in the face of much bigger adversity than when it was before. Mm. We have another question. Nikuli is asking, having achieved all that she has, it would be interesting to know what Dr. Patu's first goal was when she started her career.
Sure. You know, Nkuli, I'll be very honest. I've always, in fact, maybe that's, you know, to the point, and I've never really been asked that question. I've always really loved sport, right? As I explained, you know, when I started, I just grew up in a family where it was what we did, you know, and not necessarily excel in sports, but we just did sport and we were physically active rather, you know. And to be very honest, in high school, I played provincial netball and track as well. As I ran 800 meters and represented KZN. But I was never quite good enough to make the SA team. And at high school, that would always be my goal, to just represent South Africa. And then I went into med school, and I knew very clearly from the day that I started med school that I was going to do sports medicine, because I'd happened to hear an interview with Tim Noakes. And I was like, this is exactly the way that I want to put together like my different passions. So I just knew that at the end of med school, I want to do sports medicine. And I got there. And so when I started sports medicine, for me, it was really just about like, I want to enjoy the experience, right? I just want to be here and serve my country, I guess, and represent South Africa, wear those colors. That's as, not shallow, but like that shallow is not the right word, because I don't think it was a shallow dream, but that's really just what I wanted to do. I wanted to experience sport at, I guess, its height in a professional capacity. And then there was just so much more, you know. So it started with football and traveling with the under 17 ladies side and under 20s. And then going to these youth games, which was really incredible, going to continental and African games. And then it's been Olympics, Paralympics, and other really phenomenal experiences, which, as you've said, are really just a privilege to have been to.
Wonderful. Dr. Patu, we have some wonderful comments coming in.
Thank you, Guli.
You can see it also on the chat. Thank you. It's inspiring. Thank you for the encouragement and some thought-provoking questions. About being grateful. I would just like to
Jess Keeland as well, who is a cyclist, female cyclist, she says. And yes, Jess, you never see you hardly, let me just say, see females, or there's just too few of us out there, which is really bizarre, but there are real barriers to participation. And as I've said, I've experienced them myself. And one of the things that we were looking to do when I was still at the Sports Science Institute, but I'm going to find a way to do it in another way, was, as I said, and as a young mother, sorry, I'm digressing a little bit, but just addressing this comment that she's made. As a mom of my children right now are 6 and 3 years old. I mean, the reality is, where you're going to leave your kids, right? My husband loves to play golf. And unless you've got full-time help on a Saturday, or you can go leave your kids at granny, somebody has to stay with the kids. And so one of the things that we were looking to do at the Sports Science, just because of the facility and the type of facility it is, was to offer like a kids club to the kids, right? So while you can come, you can drop off your kids, but it's not just, you know, they're going to sit and watch TV. You know, we were going to get like a skills coach to also teach them like cycling and to do something active for that 2-3 hours that you're away, so that you can go away. And because it's simple, but it's real. Like, who's going to take care of the kids, right? And we need to start addressing those barriers. Yes, there's the finance and the cost, but we need to start addressing the other barriers as well. A big thing was women, like, you start riding probably because your partner is riding and spending so much time on the bike. And he just says to you, when you go, you get your bike, you get your nice fancy bike if he does, or you get yourself one. And he's like, just go. The faster you go, the better it is. Because with mountain biking, yes, actually, the faster you go through some technical stuff, the better it is. But that's not how you learn, that, and a big thing is a safe space. And many women just stop because they're like, this is too stressful. I'm fighting too much. I don't like this. And they fall and they hurt themselves. And so it's also about finding a safe space to learn. But this is not about cycling. I think maybe just to acknowledge that, in this quest to promote inclusion in various platforms, cycling was just an example. It's so important to recognize the barriers and actually start addressing them. Otherwise, you're not going to get to a sustainable answer, is the reality.
Mm-hmm. And I think what your talk did for us was to also point out how we can overcome those barriers to well-being in a time like this. Really well-being, even though there's lots of difficulties around us, but to move that.
Linda's saying that we need to have our own venues as lady cyclists. One of the most, I won't say revolutionary, but maybe that is even the word, things that I did find on this experience was exactly that, is the difference that there was in joining a group for female-only cyclists and riding with them in terms of the safe space. Obviously, they coach on the bike and they had skill sessions. So it's just a safe space in which to learn. It's non-competitive because there were different groups, and also just the tone of the group was very different. I've cycled with men now and I do quite a lot of it with men, but a lot less aggressive, competitive, about speed and really about experience and the conversations that you have on the bike. And honestly, it's one of the things when other female riders are wanting to ride, I often say to them, I promise you the best thing that you can do is find a ladies club. Most of them are not clubs, they're just groups of ladies that cycle together. Get a skills coach and ride with them until you're confident enough to ride. I promise you it'll change everything. And then when you're riding with a pack of females, the men can come past you, they can shout, and you know what you say? Look, if you're that fast, you should be in front of me. So you're just going to have to wait.
You just have a sign that you put up and wave at them.
If you're that fast, you should be in front of me. So just hold your horses.
I think we're going to ask you for some references on those clubs and those sports coaches, because that could be a next initiative in practically building into our well-being. I can actually share, I had my first ride on Saturday after having had COVID in February. So I think this talk is absolutely in the right way, motivating us to take it up again. Colleagues, if there's any other questions, you're welcome to post, but we're going to close off. Dr. Patu, like I said, I'm really deeply grateful for your perspective that you shared with us on the gap between where we are now and where we want to be. Thank you very much. Brollies, I trust that these sessions and the series as a whole has given each one of you what you needed to fill some gaps and maybe gain some new perspectives on how to care for yourself. Although we had communicated the series as a 12-part one, the abundance of positive feedback that we have received warrants further discussion around the extension of the initiative. So keep an eye on your inbox for a mail from Broad Cares with more information. Remember, we are in this together, even though we are apart. For now, take care. Good afternoon.